Hello, everyone, and welcome to Silent Kane. I'm Kane, your guide through stories of mystery, danger, and the hidden truths of the underworld. Let's begin today's case. A city never sleeps, but not because it doesn't want to. It can't. Neon burns holes into the night sky. Sirens cut through the mist like blunt knives, and the smoke of cheap cigarettes lingers in alleys where men vanish and women sell what little they have left to survive. Every corner hums with secrets. Every secret bleeds. Welcome to Blackwater City, a name soaked in grime and whispered through clenched teeth. This place isn't just corrupt, it thrives on corruption, breathes it in like oxygen. Cops are bought, politicians are groomed by mobsters, and justice is a commodity you can't afford unless you're willing to bleed for it. And then there's Silas Kane. Kane isn't the kind of detective who belongs to shining headlines or polished offices. He doesn't smile for photographs, doesn't take easy jobs. He's a man with a scarred mind, built out of shadows and contradictions, sharp as a scalpel, broken as a shattered mirror. Some say he used to be something else, a soldier, maybe an agent, maybe nothing more than a ghost who refused to vanish. Nobody really knows, and Kane doesn't talk about the past. What makes him dangerous isn't his gun or his fists. It's his mind. He sees what others don't. The nervous twitch of an eyelid, the way a man folds a cigarette pack before sliding it back in his pocket, the faint discoloration on a cuff where blood was once scrubbed too hard. Kane doesn't guess. He deduces. He rebuilds reality from crumbs and dust, and he makes men choke on their own lies. But in Blackwater, the truth is never clean. It's poisoned, twisted, buried under layers of fear and greed. Dig too deep, and you're bound to choke on the fumes. Kane knows this better than anyone, but he can't stop himself from digging. The past has its claws in him, and maybe, just maybe, every case is his way of clawing back at a world that swallowed him whole long ago. The Night Without Answers is not a story of heroes. There are no capes, no clean victories. It's a story of blood on rain-slicked pavement, of men who vanish into the night and women who love the wrong men too deeply. It's about power and silence, about who controls the shadows and who gets left behind in them. The case begins like they all do, a body where it doesn't belong. But soon Kane finds himself circling the orbit of something much larger, an underworld war, a vanished heirloom, a string of killings that smell of betrayal. And betrayal, in Blackwater, is currency. Alongside him, a few unlikely allies, a weary bartender with eyes that see too much, and a police sergeant who still clings to the idea of justice like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Together, they'll navigate a city that eats men alive. Opposing him? A mafia boss whose smile is more lethal than his gun. Assassins who whisper death in foreign tongues, and ghosts from Kane's own past. Ghosts that don't just haunt, but hunt. The night stretches long, and the answers refuse to come. By the end, Kane will unearth truths sharp enough to cut through flesh and bone. But the question is whether he'll survive them. Because in Blackwater, the truth doesn't set you free. It damns you. This is the world of Silas Kane. This is the Night Without Answers. The storm had settled over Blackwater like a curse. Rain slashed down in diagonal sheets, bouncing off rooftops, running in black rivers along the gutters. Neon signs bled their colors into the wet pavement. Sickly blues, reds, and greens that swirled in the pools between broken cobblestones. The air reeked of oil, cigarettes, and the rot of a city that had forgotten how to breathe, that on nights like this, most people stayed hidden, safe behind barred doors and dim lights. But Silas Kane was not most people. The night had its claws in him, and when it whispered, he listened. He cut a figure built for shadows, tall but spare, wrapped in a dark trench coat that clung to him with the weight of the downpour. His hat brim sheltered sharp eyes that tracked everything and missed nothing. A cigarette glowed faintly at the corner of his lips, its ember burning against the storm's insistence. Each drag painted his face in momentary firelight, carving the lines of a man who had seen too much and carried it all in silence. The call had come 20 minutes earlier. Sergeant Mallory, his voice taut with unease, body in an alley off Bleecker. You want to see this one? Mallory wasn't a man to share his crime scenes unless something about them felt wrong. Ken had learned that years ago. If Mallory called, it wasn't out of courtesy. It was because the scene reeked of trouble deep enough to drown in it. He walked with a slow, steady rhythm, the kind of stride that made others look away. His shoes splashed in rhythm with the thunder overhead. The deeper he moved into the heart of Bleecker, the quieter the city became, as if the rain itself had driven the night creatures into their holes. That silence bothered him. Blackwater never truly slept. If the streets were empty, it wasn't because the rain was too heavy. It was because something heavier pressed down on the air. Mallory stood at the mouth of the alley, hat low, trench coat soaked into a darker shade. Two uniforms hovered behind him, young and uneasy, their eyes refusing to follow the line of water deeper into the shadows. They were green, but not so green they didn't sense what the alley held. Kane, Mallory muttered by way of greeting. His voice rasped like gravel wet with rain. Silas gave a short nod. You said I want to see it. Mallory stepped aside. The alley yawned like a throat about to swallow him whole. A single rusted bulb buzzed halfway down, casting sickly light that glimmered against wet stone. At the bend where the alley ended, the body lay sprawled against the wall, half drowned in shadow and rain. The man had once dressed like someone who mattered. Hand-stitched Italian shoes, silk shirt beneath a tailored charcoal suit, cufflinks that caught the glow in brief sparks of gold. Even soaked and muddied, the clothing screamed wealth, influence, and arrogance. But wealth couldn't keep his throat from being opened with surgical precision, nor his face from being turned into pulp. Kane crouched slowly beside the corpse, his gloved hand brushing water from the victim's sleeve. He didn't speak at first. Silence was better. It let the alley whisper. The throat was the first truth. One stroke, angled up and across from left to right. Clean, decisive, practiced. Whoever wielded the blade had done it before. No ragged edges, no tremors of hesitation. A right-handed killer, taller than the victim, close enough to smell the last breath as it left. The face told another truth. This wasn't rage. Rage left chaos, uneven blows, loss of control. These injuries were brutal but deliberate. Methodical. Someone wanted the man beyond recognition, and the killer had followed the order to the letter. Obliteration, not frenzy. A job, not an outburst. Kane leaned closer. Embedded in the swollen cheekbone, just beneath the split skin, a thread caught the light. Dark wax cotton. He plucked it carefully, rolling it between his fingers. Wax glove stitching, cheap but industrial, like the kind used by men who work machines. Not fine leather, not fashion. Workman's gloves, repurposed for brutality. The victim's watch still gleamed on his wrist, a gold piece heavy with ostentation. But Kane's eyes narrowed. The strap had been buckled one notch tighter than the mark of habitual wear. Someone had fastened it hastily, carelessly, on the wrong hole. A detail small enough to escape most, but glaring to him. The watch hadn't always been there. It had been placed, maybe returned after being removed, maybe planted entirely. Either way, it whispered a lie. The wallet pocket was empty. A neat trick, make it look like a robbery gone sour. But the gold watch left behind said otherwise. A thief who ignored such a prize wasn't hunting money. He was hunting identity. Kane's eyes moved to the silk cuff. A smear stained the fold, darker than the arterial spray around the throat. Thicker, congealed, resistant to the rain. Not the victim's blood. The angle of the smear ran against the natural motion of the victim's arm. As if he had clutched at another's wrist during the struggle, he filed it away. One attacker, maybe more. At least one of them had left with blood, not his own. Mallory's boots scraped the cobbles behind him. Well, the sergeant asked, voice tight. Silas rose slowly, his gaze still on the corpse. Not a robbery. Mallory grimaced. No, looks plenty like one. Too much like one, Kane replied. Paper stripped, face ruined. A man this well-dressed didn't wander down Bleecker by chance. Someone wanted him erased, and they wanted us to buy the cheap story that he wasn't worth remembering. The uniforms shifted uncomfortably, exchanging looks. Rain drummed harder, tapping against their helmets like impatient fingers. Mallory scowled. You're saying it's a message? Kane's eyes caught the ruined features once more. Not a message, he said. A warning. The storm pressed harder against the city, as though the sky wanted to bury the crime before dawn could touch it. But Silas Kane stayed rooted to the scene, studying each line of shadow, each mark the rain failed to erase. For him, crime scenes were not just stains on brick and flesh. They were stage plays. The actors departed, but their movements etched into the boards. He had only to listen closely enough. He crouched again, this time scanning the cobblestones near the corpse. Water swirled around darker patches, blood diluted but not gone. The arterial spray had traveled farther than expected, a fan across the wall opposite. He followed the angle with his hand, tracing the ghost of the motion. The cut was delivered from behind, Kane murmured. Attacker came from the victim's left side, arm around the throat in a swift draw. He gestured with the flat of his hand, a blade made of air. The first strike killed. The beating was secondary, precise, impersonal. One of the young officers shifted. His name tag caught the light, Harris. His voice trembled when he spoke. If the throat was slit so clean, why smash the face after? Kane's eyes lifted to him briefly. The boy looked too young for this alley, too soft. Because the man had a name, and someone didn't want it recognized. He flicked his gaze back to the ruined features. Even if the corpse were fished from the river 3 weeks later, no grieving widow could swear it was him. The only truth left is the suit on his back. Mallory grunted. You make it sound like you know who he was. Kane stood, brushing the rain from his gloves. Not yet, but the clothes speak if you listen. He pointed with the cigarette he'd just lit. The glow carved shadows under his eyes. Those shoes, imported Italian. A Blackwater cobbler doesn't carry them. They're brought in. The suit, custom. Stitching at the shoulder too fine for off the rack. Whoever he was, he had money, and not just enough to flash at poker tables. Old money or money with reach. The sergeant scowled deeper, though Kane knew it wasn't doubt. It was the heaviness of truth pressing down. Blackwater was a city of debts, all owed to someone with a knife hidden behind a smile. Fine, Mallory said. Say he's some big shot. Why leave him here like trash? That's the point, Kane replied. His voice was low, but it carried. When a man of weight gets discarded in the gutter, it tells everyone watching that he was nothing. That's not just killing, it's theater, and it's meant for an audience. The uniforms shifted again, the rain sloshing in their boots. The storm rattled the rusted bulb above, sending a flicker of light across the walls. Kane's gaze fixed on one patch of brick near the body, scratched faintly into the mortar, shallow grooves barely wider than a nail. He stepped closer, running his glove across it. The markings weren't natural wear. They were recent, carved with desperate force. For lines, uneven, as though scraped in panic. Claw marks? Harris asked. No, Kane said. He leaned in, tracing the direction. The victim tried to brace himself. Fingers slipped against wet brick, nails tearing. He was alive when the blade touched him. No clean ambush from behind. He saw it coming. He fought. Mallory spat into the puddles. Didn't fight hard enough. Kane didn't respond immediately. His eyes had caught something else. A scrap of paper, plastered against the stones by rain. He peeled it up carefully, letting the water run free until the writing bled faintly in a focus that it was a torn corner of a cigarette pack. The brand foreign, Hungarian. Smudged ink traced half a name across it. Varela. Silas Kane's gaze sharpened, the ember of his cigarette glowing in the dark. Varela. The name carried weight in certain backrooms, whispered with caution. Anthony Varela wasn't just money. He was politics dressed in tailored suits, a man with connections that spiderweb through the city. If this corpse was Varela, then Blackwater was already on the edge of something ugly. He tucked the scrap into his coat, the detail held close. He knew his killer, Kane said finally. Close enough to be lured down here, close enough to raise his hand against him. He turned back to Mallory, rain streaming from his hat brim. This wasn't a robbery, Sergeant. It was an execution dressed up to fool rookies. Mallory's jaw tightened. The uniforms looked away. Who gains from erasing a man like Varela? Kane continued. The list is long. Rivals in politics, enemies in the underworld, partners betrayed. But the face, he gestured toward the ruined pulp. That tells me his identity was more dangerous than his death. Someone needed him nameless before the night was over. Thunder rolled overhead, long and heavy, like the city itself growling in its sleep. Mallory finally exhaled, smoke curling from his nostrils. You got that look, Kane. The one that says this body's going to drag me into places I don't want to go. Kane's reply was a faint smirk that never reached his eyes. You called me, Sergeant. You knew before I arrived. The silence between them was weighted, broken only by the rain hammering stone. Then Mallory barked orders at the uniforms to cordon the alley, his voice harsh enough to mask the unease creeping in. But Kane stayed a moment longer, letting his eyes drink in every shadow. The thread of wax cotton, the wrong watch strap, the claw marks in the wall, the foreign cigarette scrap. Each detail was a note in the symphony of violence, and Kane had begun to hear the melody. When he finally turned to leave, the alley seemed to breathe behind him, as though it had given up its secrets only reluctantly. Out on Bleecker Street, the rain poured heavier, neon bleeding across the pools of black water. Somewhere beyond the storm, the city shifted. Pieces moved in silence, unseen hands nudging pawns into place. And Silas Kane walked into the night knowing one thing for certain. Blackwater had just opened a wound, and he was the one force to trace the knife. The storm didn't ease when Silas Kane left Bleecker Alley. If anything, the sky pressed harder, forcing the city's filth deeper into the cracks. He walked beneath the sick glow of street lamps, his coat clinging wet against his frame, the cigarette burning stubbornly between his fingers. Each step echoed against the pavement like a metronome, keeping time with the night's unease. The city had its safe harbors, if you could call them that. Dim rooms where whispers held more weight than guns. For Kane, the closest one was Eddie's Bar, a two-story relic crammed between a pawn shop and a boarded-up theater on Dunhill Street. It stank of bourbon, old wood, and secrets too fragile for daylight. Inside, the haze of smoke thickened the air. Ceiling fans turned lazily, doing nothing to chase the gloom. Jazz hummed from a broken radio in the corner, scratchy trumpet fighting against static. A dozen faces bent over drinks, some too far gone to notice the rain-soaked detective slipping in, others pretending not to. In Blackwater, looking too closely at anyone could shorten your life. Eddie himself stood behind the bar, a bear of a man with shoulders that filled the space and eyes sharp enough to cut glass. He'd known Kane for years, not as a friend, but as one of those unspoken fixtures in the city's underworld. They didn't need pleasantries. Rough weather for a walk, Eddie muttered as Kane dropped onto a stool. Storm suits the city, Kane said. He tapped ash into a tray shaped like a skull. Pour me something that burns. The glass arrived heavy with bourbon, dark enough to mirror the neon bleeding in from the window. Kane let the liquor warm his throat before speaking again. You hear anything about Anthony Varela tonight? Eddie's brow twitched, small but enough. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Word is, Varela was seen with Marconi earlier. They shared a table in the back room at La Rosa. Loud talk, but no one dared get close. Kane's gaze narrowed. Marconi doesn't argue loud. He whispers. If they raised voices, it meant something was coming apart. Eddie shrugged, drying a glass that was already dry. Maybe so, but by midnight, Varela was gone. Then the storm hit. Now you're asking questions. That tells me the man didn't make it home. Kane didn't confirm. He didn't need to. Eddie had lived in Blackwater long enough to fill in the blanks. The bar door creaked open behind him. A gust of rain-laden wind followed a figure in, tall, wrapped in a trench coat, hood drawn low. The chatter dimmed. Some patrons looked away. Others stared with the dull caution of prey, sensing a predator. Kane didn't turn, but his reflection in the bourbon told him enough. The same silhouette he'd glimpsed in Bleecker Alley. Broad shoulders, stillness carved from stone. That he swallowed the last of his drink, set the glass down, and stood. "Put on my tab," he muttered. Eddie didn't argue. The figure hadn't moved from the doorway, but Kane brushed past, his coat brushing wet against the stranger's sleeve. For a moment, the air between them thickened. Kane felt eyes like ice boring through him, though the hood cast them in shadow. Out on the street again, rain hammered neon into fractured shards across the puddles. Kane lit another cigarette and began walking. His stride was steady, but his senses sharpened. He knew the rhythm of pursuit. He heard it now, the faint echo of boots a dozen paces behind. The alley ahead was narrow, an artery between crumbling buildings. He slipped into it, smoke trailing from his mouth, letting the night close in around him. The man followed. Under the flicker of a rusted bulb, Kane finally turned. The stranger stepped forward, lowering the hood. The face was angular, scars slicing across one cheek like a blade of its own. Pale blue eyes, steady and unblinking. A knife glinted in his hand, blade reversed for the kill. "You had your chance earlier," Kane said, his voice calm against the rain. "If you wanted me dead, I'd be cooling beside Varela already. So what is this, watchdog duty? Or a warning?" The man didn't answer. He just stared, water dripping from his jaw, hand resting easy on the blade. Kane exhaled smoke, studying him the way he studied every crime scene. Professional. You don't botch a cut like that. Precise, efficient. But the face, he gestured toward an invisible corpse. That was clumsy, Loud. Not your work. That was an order. Somebody wanted him erased. For a heartbeat, the assassin's eyes flickered. It was small, but Kane read it. Confirmation. "You're not going to talk," Kane continued. "But silence says enough. Whoever you work for doesn't trust me out of the picture. Yet. They want to see how far I dig before they decide." The man stepped closer, knife low, rain running down the steel like veins of mercury. For a moment, Kane thought the blade would flash. But instead, the killer stopped within reach, gaze locked. Then, without a word, he turned and melted back into the storm, swallowed whole by Blackwater's veins. Kane stood alone under the sputtering light, smoke curling from his lips. The night had given him answers, but not the kind he could use yet. Anthony Varela was dead. Marconi was in play, and a ghost with a scar and a knife had just walked out of the darkness, leaving Kane alive for reasons that would matter soon enough. The city moaned with thunder overhead, as if mocking him. Blackwater had never been generous with truth. It gave pieces, fragments, scraps washed in rain. And Kane, as always, was left to stitch them into a pattern before the whole rotten structure collapsed on top of him. He flicked the cigarette into the puddle, the ember dying with a hiss. Then he turned his collar up and walked into the storm, the unanswered questions trailing him like smoke. Tonight, Blackwater had opened with a body. Tomorrow, it would start bleeding. Morning crawled into Blackwater with a sickly yellow sky. Rain hadn't stopped. It never did, but the storm had quieted into a steady drizzle that draped the city in a curtain of gray. Puddles mirrored broken neon signs, gutters choked with cigarette butts and dreams that had drowned long before the night ended. Silas Kane hadn't slept. He rarely did after nights like that. A dead man's face, what was left of it, stayed in his mind like a brand, refusing to fade. He carried that weight with him as he climbed the stone steps of the 9th Precinct, a squat building that smelled of mildew, old coffee, and tired law. Inside, The station buzzed with routine, typewriters clacking, phones ringing, boots clattering on worn linoleum. But beneath the surface, Kane knew what it really was, a hive of nerves and bureaucracy, trying to hold back a tide of rot it could never stop at the far end. Detective Rachel Moore hunched over a stack of reports. She was younger than Kane by a decade, but her eyes had the same shadowed depth, the same exhaustion carved into the edges. She had been one of the few who still spoke to him after he left the force under circumstances neither liked to mention. When she saw him, her brows rose. Well, if it isn't the ghost of the precinct. What hole did you crawl out of this time, Kane? He smirked faintly, though his eyes stayed cold. Same hole as always. Just came to see what the official line is on Anthony Varela. Moore's lips tightened. She checked over her shoulder before answering. Why am I not surprised you're already sniffing around this? Because you know me, Kane said simply. He leaned against her desk, lighting a cigarette despite the no smoking sign glaring down at him. Smoke curled into the stale air. So, what's the story they're feeding the press? She sighed, flipping a folder open with reluctant fingers. Male mid-40s, throat cut. No ID found, but prints matched Anthony Varela. You were right. He's ours. Kane's eyes narrowed. Cause of death is obvious, but what about the face? They mentioned that. Moore's expression darkened. Yeah, Coroner said it looked deliberate. Not just rage, symbolic. Like someone wanted to make sure he couldn't be recognized. Or remembered, Kane muttered. Moore studied him for a long beat. Look, Silas, this isn't your case. Varela was connected to people who make cops disappear. The brass want this swept under the rug as quick as possible. The last thing they want is you stirring things up again. He chuckled dryly. You mean the last thing they want is truth? Can't have that spilling into daylight. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. You think Marconi's behind it, don't you? I think Marconi was there, Kane replied. And if he wasn't the hand that cut Varela's throat, then he's the reason it happened. But there's more. There was a third player. Someone in the shadows. Moore tapped her pen against the desk, restless. You're playing with fire. Last time you did that, it burned more than just you. For a second, Kane's gaze drifted, past her, past the smoke and walls, back into some memory he never spoke aloud. Something that carved itself into him years ago, a ghost heavier than sleep. Then it was gone. He crushed the cigarette in her ashtray. Fire's the only thing that keeps the city from freezing over, he said. Do me a favor, Rachel. If the reports show anything unusual, fibers, prints, anything, get word to me. I'll owe you. She shook her head, but he caught the faintest flicker of a smile. You already owe me more than you can pay, Kane. Story of my life. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked out into the rain again. Outside, the city greeted him with sirens wailing somewhere in the distance and the sour tang of wet asphalt. He lit another cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face against the gloom. Information was thin, but it was enough to sharpen the trail. Varela, Marconi, and an unseen hand pulling threads in the dark. Blackwater was tightening, and Silas Kane could already feel the noose drawing close. The rain never left Blackwater, it only changed moods. By late afternoon, it had thickened again, sheets of water slicing down from a sky the color of bruised metal. Silas Kane's trench coat was soaked by the time he reached Little Calavera, the quarter of the city where neon signs sputtered in Spanish and Italian, where shadows were thicker than daylight. Oh, hey, Rosa sat at the corner of Delacroix and 8th, a red glass lantern glowing above its narrow doorway. From the street, it looked like just another restaurant, modest, with lace curtains and fading paint, but Kane knew better. La Rosa was Marconi's ground, a sanctuary where whispers carried more weight than bullets. Inside, the place smelled of garlic, smoke, and cheap wine. A jukebox hummed an old tango in the corner, its melancholy notes sliding across the dimly lit room. A few scattered patrons hunched over their plates, but their eyes said they weren't there for food. Every man at a table had the heavy shoulders of muscle for hire, and every woman smiled with lips that never touched their eyes. That Kane's entrance drew stares. He let them stare. His reputation had always walked a few steps ahead of him. He removed his hat, shook off the rain, and made his way to the bar. The bartender, a narrow man with slicked back hair and a nervous smile, froze when he recognized him. "Senor Kane," he whispered, glancing around as though the walls themselves might report him. "I did not expect. No one ever does." Kane cut in smoothly. He set down a damn pack of cigarettes and tapped one free. "Scotch. No ice." The glass slid across him, trembling slightly in the bartender's hand. Kane sipped, eyes sweeping the room without turning his head. He cataloged everything. The man in the far booth whose jacket bulged wrong at the ribs, the smudge of cigar ash near the window seat, the faint stain of wine on the floor where someone had stood too fast recently. "La Rosa remembers its guests," Kane murmured. "Anthony Varela was here the night he died." The bartender stiffened. I don't know names." "You know faces," Kane pressed. "And you know who they sit with. Varela had company, didn't he? Marconi, maybe, and someone else." The bartender swallowed, eyes darting to the far booth. "Please, senor. If I talk, I am dead." Kane leaned in, voice soft but edged like a razor. "You're already dead if you don't. It just takes longer." For a moment, the bartender's mask cracked. His gaze flicked toward a table against the back wall, where a vase of roses sat. 3 of them, wilted, their petals browning at the edges. Then he looked away. They sat there. Varela, Marconi, and a man I did not know. Tall, foreign. He smoked strange cigarettes. Not American. They smelled sharp like cloves. Clove cigarettes. Kane filed it away instantly. A small detail, but sometimes the smallest threads unraveled the largest knots. "What happened?" he asked. They argued. The bartender whispered, voices low but tense. Varela drank too much wine. Marconi barely touched his glass. The third man, he only listened, sometimes smiling. When they left, Varela looked afraid. Kane's eyes narrowed. Fear, not anger, not drunken bravado. Fear meant he'd seen something in that third man that rattled him to the bone. Before Kane could press further, a shadow fell across the bar. 2 men loomed beside him, broad shoulders, dark suits, the unmistakable bulk of pistols under their jackets. "Mr. Kane," one of them said in a voice smooth as gravel. "The boss doesn't like you asking questions here." Kane didn't flinch. He sipped his scotch, savoring the burn. "Tell your boss the city's full of questions. I just happen to be the only one trying to answer them." The second thug grinned humorlessly. "Careful. Curiosity is unhealthy. Only if you're the kind of man who's afraid of answers." Kane shot back. He set down the glass, flicked ash from his cigarette, and turned to face them squarely. "Now, unless either of you two is the mystery guest who smokes cloves, I suggest you step aside." The words hung in the smoky air. For a moment, Kane thought fists would fly, but then the bartender coughed sharply, a signal, desperate. The thugs exchanged a glance, muttered something in Italian, and backed away, though not without leaving a final glare sharp enough to cut glass. Kane left the bar and moved toward the table with the wilted roses. He slid into the booth, tracing the lip of the wine glass left behind. Dried crimson stained the rim. He leaned closer. Beneath the tang of sour wine was another scent, faint but distinct, cloves, just as the bartender said. His fingers brushed the ashtray. 2 butts lay there. One was a Cuban, half-smoked. The other was thin, brown-wrapped, smelling sweet and acrid. Kane lifted it, studied the burn pattern, the cut of the filter. Foreign make. Expensive. The kind of indulgence that screamed power or arrogance that he pocketed it. Evidence was thin in Blackwater, but sometimes a single cigarette told more than a witness. He rose to leave. His eyes caught another detail. A single matchbook tucked under the vase. Black cover, gold letters, Hotel St. Denis. Kane's pulse ticked faster. That wasn't a coincidence. The rain outside greeted him like an old adversary, pelting his coat as he stepped into the street. He lit another cigarette, watching smoke curl into the night. A third man at the table. Foreign. Close. And now a hotel. The web was tightening, and Kane could feel its threads coiling around him. Somewhere in the dark, someone was pulling strings. And Anthony Varela had been the first to dance until the cord snapped. The storm swallowed him whole the moment he stepped back into the street. Blackwater's alleys turned into rivers of filth, neon reflections twisting across puddles like broken glass. Kane moved fast, trench coat pulled tight, cigarette clamped between his teeth. His mind worked faster than his legs, clove cigarettes. A foreign guest at Marconi's table. And now, the Hotel St. Denis. The St. Denis was no ordinary lodging. Kane knew it by reputation. A gilded cage in the North Quarter, home to foreign dignitaries, smugglers with silver tongues, and anyone rich enough to pay for silence. Its velvet curtains had hidden more secrets than the city archives ever could. Kane turned onto Carmine Street, the rain tapping in irregular rhythms on the brim of his hat. His senses sharpened, every instinct telling him he wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed faintly behind him, just out of sync with his own. He slowed, then stopped near a flickering street lamp. The glow painted long shadows on the wet pavement. "Following a man in this weather," Kane said without turning. "You must be either desperate or suicidal." Silence answered him. The footsteps ceased. Kane let the pause stretch, his hand brushing the butt of the revolver inside his coat. Then movement. A shape darted from the alley, knife catching a flash of neon. The attack came low, fast, but Kane was faster. He twisted, the blade missing his ribs by inches, and drove his elbow back into the assailant's jaw. The man grunted, staggered, then lunged again. Kane drew his revolver in one fluid motion, pressing the cold steel barrel against the attacker's temple. The knife clattered to the ground. "Talk," Kane growled, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Who sent you?" The man's breath was ragged, eyes wide beneath a soaked cap. I don't know names. I just deliver messages. Funny way of delivering. They said, scare you. Keep you away from St. Denis. Nothing more." Kane's jaw tightened. St. Denis again. Whoever this foreigner was, he didn't want company sniffing around his hotel. Describe him. The thug hesitated. Kane cocked the hammer back with a deliberate click. "Tall," the man stammered. "Maybe 6'3". Accent. "I don't know. Not local. He pays in crisp bills, foreign too. Smokes strange cigarettes, cloves, sweet like perfume." So the rumor at La Rosa was no lie. Kane eased the revolver back a fraction. "You've bought yourself a heartbeat longer. Use it. Why kill Varela?" The thug shook his head violently. "I wasn't there. I don't know. Please." Kane studied him, then made a choice. He brought the revolver down sharply across the man's temple. The body slumped into the gutter, unconscious, rainwater coursing over his face. Kane holstered the weapon and lit another cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the hard lines of his face. He exhaled smoke into the storm. Pieces were forming. A foreigner entrenched in Marconi's circle, using intimidation to mask something bigger. But why Varela? What had the councilman stumbled into that cost him his life? By the time Kane reached his apartment, the clock had slid past midnight. His building was a crumbling relic on Mercer Street, the kind of place where leaky pipes sang lullabies and neighbors knew better than to ask questions. He climbed the stairs, boots heavy with water, every step echoing like a verdict. Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee and smoke. He shrugged off his coat, hung his hat, and set the recovered cigarette butt and matchbook on his desk. Both looked small, almost insignificant, but Kane knew better. Entire cases had been cracked by smaller threads that he sat, staring at them through the haze of smoke curling in his lamplight. The clove cigarette was foreign, expensive, not a thug's indulgence, but a man of taste or vanity. The matchbook, however, spoke louder. Hôtel Saint-Denis. A rendezvous point, perhaps. Or a nest. Kane leaned back, eyes half closed, replaying the bartender's words. Varela had argued, drunk, fearful. Marconi silent. The foreigner smiling. The smile of a man who already held the knife behind the curtain that a soft creak interrupted his thoughts. The floorboard by the window groaned. That Kane's revolver was in his hand before his eyes were fully open. He rose, moving silently toward the shadowed window. Rain streaked the glass, but behind it, motion. A figure clung to the fire escape, trying to slip away. Kane shoved the window open, lightning flashing as he aimed. Hold it right there. The figure froze, then turned its head. For a heartbeat, Kane saw the glint of pale eyes, sharp and calculating. The stranger lifted something, a cigarette, to his lips. He lit it. The wind carried the scent through the rain. Cloves, sweet and acrid. Then he was gone, vanishing into the storm like a ghost. Kane lowered his weapon slowly, the echo of the clove smoke still lingering in the room. The foreigner had been here, close enough to touch. Watching, testing. The game had moved from whispers in restaurants to shadows outside, Kane's own window. The web was no longer tightening around Varela. It was tightening around him. The Hotel St. Denis rose from the northern quarter like a monument to excess. Its facade, washed in rain and neon, glistened against the rotting brick and shuttered windows of surrounding tenements. The lobby doors, brass-framed and gleaming under the drizzle, looked as though they belonged to another city, another world entirely. One where secrets were currency and discretion was law. Silas Kane stood across the street, collar high, hat brim dripping. The storm had not relented. Thunder rolled low, like a predator's growl behind the skyline. He took in the building with the careful patience of a chess player studying the board before the first move. His eyes lingered on the doormen, two broad-shouldered men in tailored coats, too disciplined for common hotel staff. Soldiers masquerading as hospitality. Kane lit a cigarette, shielding the flame from the rain. The smoke mingled with the night air, sweet with damp stone and gasoline. He noted the shadows at the hotel's corners, lookouts, no doubt. Whoever lodged inside had money and reason enough to post guards that he crossed the street casually, slipping into the role of a weary traveler. His revolver weighed heavy beneath his coat, comfort and caution in equal measure. Inside, the St. Denis exhaled warmth and gold. Chandeliers glittered overhead, their crystals dripping light like champagne. The air smelled of tobacco and perfume, an intoxicating contrast to the sour stench outside. Kane's eyes, however, were fixed not on the grandeur but on the details. The faint bulge beneath a concierge's jacket, the slight nod exchange between two men at the bar, the way the elevator attendant's gaze swept the room as though cataloging threats that a pianist in the corner coaxed a languid melody from ivory keys, filling the space with a veneer of civility. But beneath it all, Kane felt the same pulse he'd sensed at La Rosa, a rhythm of tension, of hidden conversations and concealed deals. He approached the front desk, where a man with a polished smile and hollow eyes greeted him. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the St. Denis. May I assist you?" Kane returned the smile, faint but convincing. "A room for the night. Something quiet. Discretion is worth the price." The clerk's eyes flicked over him, assessing. Kane's attire, though rain-soaked, bore the cut of quality. His voice carried a weight, a calm confidence that suggested he belonged here. After a moment's hesitation, the clerk slid a pen across the register. "Of course, sir. We pride ourselves on our discretion." As Kane signed a false name, he noted the other entries: foreign surnames, initials, careful omissions. He slipped the pen back and accepted his key. The room was on the fourth floor, overlooking the street. Kane climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator. Elevators could be death traps in places like this. Too many blind corners, too much control surrendered to unseen hands. The hallway was quiet, plush carpets swallowing his footsteps. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it softly behind him. The room smelled of lavender polish and cigar smoke, the kind of scent that clung to velvet curtains and mahogany wardrobes. But Kane's attention fixed on the ashtray by the window. A cigarette smoldered there, fresh. Not tobacco. Cloves. His pulse slowed, steady but sharpened. The foreigner had been here, or perhaps still was. Kane drew his revolver and crossed the room in silence, checking corners, the bathroom, the wardrobe. Empty, he returned to the ashtray. The cigarette had burned less than half its length before being crushed. A hurried departure interrupted. Kane picked it up delicately, examining the paper, the tightness of the roll, the faint stamp of a foreign manufacturer he didn't recognize. Evidence, small but potent, he set it back and turned toward the desk. A letter lay half hidden beneath the blotter, the corner peeking out as though forgotten in haste. Kane unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, not American. The cargo arrives at Pier 17, Wednesday. Ensure the councilman's silence remains permanent. Payment follows delivery. Kane exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. The pieces clicked with a grim inevitability. Varela had known about this cargo. Smuggling, contraband, something worth killing a politician for. He'd threatened to expose it, maybe try to bargain. And someone had silenced him. The note bore no signature, only a crest embossed faintly in the paper, a twin-headed eagle clutching a crown. Foreign, old world. Footsteps in the hallway froze Kane's thoughts. He moved to the door, ear close, revolver ready. Two voices murmured in a language he couldn't place. European, perhaps. The cadence was sharp, guttural. They stopped outside his door. Kane's finger tightened on the trigger. The knob rattled once, softly. Then silence. After a long pause, the footsteps moved on. Kane let out a breath, lowering the gun. Whoever they were, they'd known this room was occupied. The St. Denis was no mere hotel. It was a fortress for international dealings, its walls thick with intrigue. He pocketed the letter, stashed the cigarette butt, and sat by the window. Below, the city churned under the storm, lights bleeding across slick pavement. Somewhere out there, the foreigner was watching, waiting, orchestrating. Kane knew one thing with certainty. The answers would not come willingly. He'd have to peel them from the city's underbelly, one layer at a time. And tonight, the game had shifted. He was no longer chasing shadows. The shadows were chasing him. Kane didn't sleep. He sat in the armchair by the window, cigarette after cigarette burning down to stubs in the tray. The rain eased close to dawn, but the city remained restless, its streets glimmering like veins beneath the neon arteries of the quarter. The note and the clove cigarette lay on the desk before him, silent witnesses. He studied them between drags, reconstructing the scene like an autopsy of the invisible. The foreigner had been here. The handwriting suggested sophistication, aristocracy perhaps. The cigarette, a rare import. Together, they painted a man who moved with money and culture, someone foreign enough to remain hidden in plain sight. At T4 o'clock, movement stirred below. Kane leaned forward, watching through the slit in the curtains. A black sedan rolled up to the curb, headlights cutting through the mist. Two men stepped out, broad, rigid, military in bearing. They weren't guests. They were escorts. Moments later, a third figure emerged from the hotel. Tall, slender, wrapped in a dark overcoat with a collar that concealed half his face. The foreigner? Kane strained to catch more, but the man's hat brim and the shadows did the work of disguise. The trio slid into the sedan and drove off. Kane made his choice quickly. He pocketed the note, checked his revolver, and slipped out the door. The hallway was empty, but the silence was thick, almost staged. He descended the stairs, boots soundless on the carpet, and slipped into the lobby. The pianist still played, though his eyes followed Kane with quiet suspicion. The concierge greeted him with the same hollow smile as before, but Kane noticed the phone receiver resting slightly off the hook. A signal, a warning. Someone was already reporting his movements. Kane didn't pause. He pushed through the revolving doors and stepped back into the wet dawn. The sedan was gone, but its trail wasn't. Tire tracks glistened in the puddles, cutting a line toward the docks. He moved fast, blending into the thinning night crowd. By the time he reached the corner, the street was waking, milk trucks rattling, newsboys shouting headlines, dockhands trudging toward their shifts. Kane's eyes scanned everything, his mind filtering the noise. And then he saw her. She leaned against a lamppost, trench coat buttoned tight, fedora pulled low. The smoke from her cigarette curled like a ribbon around her face. Her eyes caught his, sharp and knowing. "Detective Kane," she said softly, stepping into his path. He froze. Few people in this city used his name without hesitation. Fewer still spoke it with such familiarity. "Depends who's asking," he said. The woman smiled faintly, not warmth but recognition. "Name's Celeste Moreau. I've been following the same trail you have. And if you keep chasing ghosts without help, you'll end up another body on the morgue slab." Kane studied her. Her accent was Parisian, smoothed by years abroad. The cut of her coat was European, the kind that didn't come cheap. She held herself with the poise of someone accustomed to danger. "What trail?" he asked. Celeste flicked ash into the gutter. "The shipment. Pier 17. You've already found part of the puzzle, haven't you?" Kane's jaw tightened. "What do you know about the foreigner?" Her eyes narrowed at the name, a flicker of something, fear or anger, passing across her face. "Enough to know you don't want to be on his radar. He deals in silence. Permanent silence." Kane stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Councilman Varela. He was killed because of this cargo." Celeste's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, she looked away, as if weighing how much truth to release. Varela wanted to play both sides. He thought he could take the foreigner's money and still keep his conscience. That's a dangerous mistake. The rain began again, thin and cold, running down Kane's collar. His mind ticked through the possibilities. If Celeste had this information, she wasn't an ordinary informant. She was tied to the network somehow. Maybe inside it, maybe burned by it. "Why tell me any of this?" Kane asked. "Because," she said, stubbing out her cigarette with deliberate force, "I need him stopped as badly as you do. And because Pier 17 isn't just about smuggling. It's about power. If that cargo lands, the city won't belong to its people anymore. It'll belong to the shadows." Before Kane could respond, a sound cut through the street. The rumble of an engine, too fast, too close. A car turned the corner, headlights blazing. The windows rolled down. Kane barked, pulling Celeste with him into the gutter. Gunfire erupted, shattering glass, tearing chunks from the lamppost. Passers-by screamed and scattered as the sedan roared past, bullets stitching the air. Kane drew his revolver, firing 2 shots after the vehicle. One slug punched the rear fender, sparking metal, but the car didn't stop. It vanished into the labyrinth of streets, leaving only echoes and smoke. Silence returned in fractured pieces. The city carried on as if nothing had happened, though the air still trembled with violence. Kane pulled Celeste to her feet, brushing grime from his coat. "They know you," he said grimly. "They know us," she corrected, her eyes hard. "Which means we're closer than they want us to be." Kane holstered his weapon, scanning the rooftops, the alleys, every shadow that might conceal another threat. He felt the walls closing in, the city tightening its grip. Celeste lit another cigarette, hands steady despite the near miss. "We can't stay out here. Too exposed. There's a place we can talk." Kane hesitated, then nodded. For now, trust was a necessity. But he kept his guard high. They slipped into the waking streets together, blending with dockhands and drifters, 2 silhouettes against the rain-smeared dawn. Above them, the city loomed, indifferent and immense, its secrets buried deep in steel and stone. And somewhere, the foreigner watched, orchestrating from the dark. They moved quickly, slipping through alleys that smelled of fish, diesel, and rot. Celeste walked ahead, every stride purposeful, as if she knew exactly which cracks in the city led to safety. Kane followed, coat collar turned up, eyes scanning every rooftop and passing stranger. The city never slept, but it had moods. This morning it felt hung over and angry. She led him to a basement bar near the waterfront, the kind of place where sunlight never entered and secrets aged like whiskey. A neon sign buzzed half-dead above the door. Le Siren. Inside, the smell of stale smoke and damp would hit Kane like a memory. The bartender looked up as they entered, recognized Celeste, and said nothing. She guided Kane to a booth in the back, shadowed with a cracked leather seat. She ordered 2 bourbons neat. The glasses arrived, amber and accusing. "You're wondering if you can trust me," Celeste said, her accent curling around the words. Kane studied her over the rim of his glass. "Wondering if you're bait. Or worse, if you're already bought." She smiled faintly. "If I were bait, you'd already be dead. They don't leave questions behind." That was true, and Kane hated that it was true. He leaned back, the wood of the booth pressing cold against his shoulders. "Start talking. What's on Pier 17? Celeste lit a cigarette, exhaled smoke that curled like handwriting above the table. "Weapons. Crates of them. Not the kind you buy in alley deals, the kind that shifts the balance of a city. Automatic rifles, explosives, even some military prototypes that shouldn't exist outside a war zone. If those reach the foreigners' buyers, this city will burn." Kane's fingers drummed against the glass. Weapons meant escalation, power, changing hands. And power was always blood-soaked. "Who's buying?" he asked. Her eyes flickered, a hesitation Kane caught instantly. "Mafia families, corrupt officials, foreign syndicates. The foreigner is just the broker, but he's the one who ensures no one talks. Ever." Kane's mind assembled the puzzle. Varela had opposed new developments on the docks. Maybe he knew Pier 17 wasn't just for trade. It was a corridor for smuggling. He'd crossed the wrong people, perhaps tried to back out. The foreigner had silenced him to keep the path clear. "Why you?" Kane asked sharply. "Why are you in this? You're not just some bystander who happened to know the word foreigner." Celeste's jaw tightened. For the first time, the mask slipped. "Because I lost someone to him. My brother. He thought he could outsmart the network, skim from their profits. He ended up in the river. What the boots? No funeral." The way she said it, calm, precise, as though rehearsed, made it sound less like confession and more like oath. Kane believed her, but he also recognized the danger. Vengeance blurred lines. The bar's jukebox wheezed into life, some forgotten jazz number, the notes broken and metallic. Kane focused back on Celeste. "If we go to Pier 17, he said slowly, "we don't walk in guns blazing. We need proof. Something to tie this to the foreigner." Celeste leaned forward, eyes gleaming in the half-light. "I could get us inside. There's a shift change tonight. Dock hands replaced at midnight. The guards are sloppy, but once the crates start moving, security doubles. That's our window." Kane absorbed every word, mapping the plan in his mind. Midnight at Pier 17. One chance, but something still gnawed at him. The meticulousness of the foreigner. Men like that didn't leave loose ends. Yet here Celeste was alive, speaking his name. Why? Either the foreigner underestimated her, or he wanted her to lead someone straight into his web. He didn't voice the suspicion. Not yet. Instead, he said, "I'll need to see the manifests. Cargo papers, anything that shows what's inside those crates. Without evidence, all we'll have is a story. And stories don't bring down men like him." Celeste nodded. "I know someone at the harbor office. He's scared, but he owes me. We can pay him a visit before nightfall." Kane finished his bourbon, the burn trailing down his throat like fire. He slid from the booth, adjusted his hat. "Then we move now. Every hour we waste, someone else dies." They left the bar, the city now fully awake, alive with traffic and shouts. Kane felt eyes on him as they crossed the street, shadows that shifted when he turned. Paranoia wasn't paranoia if it was earned. The harbor office squatted on the edge of the docks, a concrete block with rusting windows and a flag that hung limp in the drizzle. Inside, the air smelled of salt and ink. Clerks hunched over typewriters, their eyes sunken from too many late shifts. Celeste led him to a corner office where a balding man sat chewing on a pencil. He looked up, panic flashing across his face when he saw her. "Madame Moreau," he stammered. "I told you I can't." "You can," Celeste interrupted. "And you will. This is Detective Kane. He needs to see the manifest for Pier 17, shipment from the freighter Neruda." The man paled. His fingers twitched against the pencil like a metronome. "If they find out I spoke, they won't." Kane cut in, his voice low, steady. "You'll hand me the papers. Then you'll forget I was ever here. You'll keep your head down, keep typing, and you'll live." The man's eyes darted between them, calculating fear against survival. Finally, he opened a drawer, slid out a thin folder, and placed it on the desk with trembling hands. Kane opened it. Rows of typed entries lined the pages, crates labeled as machinery parts, construction supplies, medical equipment. Too clean, too ordinary, which meant it was a lie. But in the margins, handwritten notes caught Kane's eye. Numbers, coded references. One line read, 17B, special handling, foreign consignee. The foreigner. Kane closed the folder. Good enough. He slid the papers into his coat. "You never saw us." The man nodded frantically, already burying himself in his typewriter as if words alone could protect him. Outside, the air was colder, sharper. The docks stretched out in both directions, cranes looming like skeletons against the gray sky. Kane and Celeste stood at the edge, watching ships groan in their berths. Celeste pulled her coat tighter. "So, midnight, Pier 17. Kane lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke into the salt air. His mind was already 10 steps ahead, imagining the guards, the trucks, the cargo. Imagining the foreigner watching from some unseen vantage, waiting for him to make the wrong move. "Midnight," Kane said, and no later. The city hummed beneath them, restless, dangerous. A storm was coming, not of weather, but of bullets and betrayal. Kane felt it in his bones. For now, the pieces were set. The next move would decide who bled, who vanished, and who controlled the night. And Kane knew one truth above all. In this city, answers always cost blood. The city never looked darker than it did at midnight. IT wasn't just the absence of light. It was the weight of silence, broken only by the groan of ships and the faint hiss of the tide against rotting wood. The rain had eased, leaving the streets slick with neon reflections. Pier 17 stretched ahead like a scar at the edge of the harbor, a graveyard of shipping containers and skeletal cranes. Silas Kane stood in the shadows of a derelict warehouse, the brim of his hat dripping water. His coat clung heavy against him, smelling of rain and cigarette smoke. Beside him, Celeste Moreau adjusted her gloves, her face a pale shape in the dim glow of a sodium lamp. She looked steady, but Kane could see the tension in her jaw. "This is it," she whispered. "The shift change happens in 10 minutes." Kane nodded, eyes tracing the scene before them. 3 trucks idled near the pier, their engines humming low, plumes of exhaust curling upward. Men in heavy coats moved crates with mechanical efficiency. Each crate bore the stenciled letters 17B. Guard with rifles slung casually over their shoulders smoked by the dock's edge. Too relaxed, too sure of themselves, Kane's instincts prickled. Something was wrong. He'd learned to read the stage before the curtain rose, and this scene felt prepared, arranged not just for smuggling, but for an audience. "Keep close," Kane murmured. They moved silently, skirting the edge of stacked containers, boots whispering over wet concrete. Every shadow was a knife's edge. Every clink of metal, every cough from the dock workers seemed amplified against the stillness of the harbor. Kane counted movements. For guards visible, 3 dock hands, 2 drivers. Too few for cargo this valuable, which meant others were watching, unseen. His gut twisted, the same way it had on cases where corpses turned up face down in rivers. They reached a vantage point behind a container stacked 3 high. Kane crouched, peering through a gap in the steel. A dockhand pried open one crate. Inside, beneath a layer of straw, gleamed rifles, sleek, modern military grade. Celeste drew a sharp breath. Kane pressed a finger to his lips. Quiet. The dockhand resealed the crate, slapped it twice as signal. A driver barked an order, and the crate was loaded into the waiting truck. Kane leaned close to Celeste. That's our proof. But it's not enough. We need something that ties this to the foreigner. Celeste's eyes flickered with determination. There's an office on site. They'll keep shipping manifests, coded receipts. If we get them. Her words froze as a sound cut through the night. A whistle. Sharp, deliberate. The guard straightened. Rifles came off shoulders in one fluid motion. The dockhand stepped back. Kane's hand instinctively moved toward the revolver under his coat, but something made him stop. The whistle wasn't alarm. It was signal. From the far side of the pier, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. A group of men emerged, silhouettes carved against the glow of the truck lights. At their center walked a figure in a tailored overcoat, gloved hands clasped behind his back. His hat cast his face in shadow, but his presence radiated command. Celeste tensed beside Kane. Her whisper was barely audible. Him, the foreigner. Kane studied the man as he approached the trucks, inspecting the crates with a nod of approval. He spoke briefly to one of the guards, an accent Kane couldn't place, smooth and precise. The guard laughed too hard at something he said. Men like that didn't joke. They dictated that Kane's mind raced. The foreigner's presence here meant two things: confidence and control. Men at his level didn't get their hands dirty unless they were certain of safety, which meant this pier wasn't just guarded. It was a trap. Celeste shifted, eyes locked on the foreigner with something between fear and fury. Kane caught her wrist before she could move. His grip was iron. Not yet, he hissed. You'll get your chance, but not like this. Her breath came fast, shallow, but she nodded reluctantly. Kane released her wrist. The foreigner raised a hand. The movement was casual, but the effect was immediate. Silence swept the pier. Even the idling trucks seemed to hum lower, as if acknowledging command. He lit a cigarette, the flare briefly illuminating sharp cheekbones, eyes cold as the harbor. Then he spoke. His voice carried easily across the dock, a low baritone that slipped beneath the skin. There is order in business, he said, even in shadows. Those who respect order prosper. Those who betray it, he flicked ash into the tide. Feed the tide. The dockhands chuckled nervously. One guard spat into the water. The foreigner continued his inspection, glancing once toward the harbor office. Kane caught the subtle nod he gave a bodyguard. Something was about to happen. Suddenly, Kane realized the truth. They weren't waiting for the shift change. They were waiting for him. Kane grabbed Celeste's arm. We're burned. Move. They slipped back into the maze of containers just as two guards split from the group, sweeping the area with flashlights. The beams cut through fog, slicing dangerously close to their path. Kane and Celeste ducked into a narrow corridor between containers, pressed flat against rusting steel. The guards' voices echoed, rough and careless. Boss said they'd come. Some detective sniffing around. Won't leave tonight alive. Celeste's eyes widened. Kane's jaw tightened. He wasn't surprised, only confirmed. This was theater, and they were the main act. The flashlights passed. Kane pulled Celeste deeper into the labyrinth, his mind racing. The foreigner had anticipated them, lured them here. But why? To kill them, yes, but also to show them. Men like the foreigner liked their power displayed. It wasn't enough to kill. It had to be spectacle. They reached the shadow of the harbor office. Kane crouched low, scanning windows. Light flickered inside. Figures moved. He gestured for silence, then edged to the door. Locked. He pulled a thin piece of wire from his pocket, a habit from cases that required less official entries. The lock clicked open with quiet finality. Inside, the office reeked of mildew and ink. Papers were strewn across desks, typewriters abandoned mid-sentence. Kane moved quickly, rifling drawers, scanning ledgers. He found what he needed, a ledger marked with coded entries identical to those in the manifest he'd taken earlier. Dates, shipment numbers, destinations. One entry bore initials, FR the foreigner's signature. Kane slipped the ledger into his coat. Proof enough. But as he turned, a gloved hand slammed against the doorframe. .2 guards filled the entrance, rifles raised. Detective Kane, one sneered. Boss wants a word. Celeste's hand twitched toward her bag, but Kane shook his head. Outnumbered, cornered. No clean way out. For now, the game was compliance that he raised his hand slowly. Lead the way. They were marched back onto the pier, rifles at their backs. The foreigner waited by the trucks, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. He regarded Kane with mild interest, as though observing a specimen rather than a man. So, the foreigner said, voice even, the detective comes sniffing in my house. Brave or foolish? Kane's reply was steady. Truth has a way of leaking, even through cracks in steel. The foreigner smiled faintly, a smile without warmth. Truth? In this city, truth is whatever men with power allow it to be. He stepped closer, his gaze flicking briefly to Celeste. And you bring me gifts. How thoughtful. Celeste's face hardened. You kill my brother. The foreigner exhaled smoke unbothered. I've killed many brothers. Remind me, was his name worth remembering? Her body tensed, rage surging, but Kane caught her arm, grounding her. He met the foreigner's gaze. You can kill us, Kane said, but you'll never bury the evidence. The papers are already moving. By morning, your buyers will know your shipments are compromised. It was a bluff, a dangerous one, but Kane delivered it with the calm certainty of a man who'd already won. The foreigner's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. He flicked ash to the ground, studied Kane for a long moment. Then, he nodded once to his men. Take them, he said softly. Let the tide decide. The night swallowed them as the guards marched Kane and Celeste toward the edge of the pier. The water below churned black, restless, slapping against barnacle-crusted pylons. The smell of salt and oil hung heavy in the air. From a distance, the harbor lights twinkled like dying stars, indifferent to what was about to happen. The guards didn't speak much. Professional silence. Just the rhythmic crunch of boots against wet planks, the occasional click of a rifle bolt being adjusted. Kane kept his pace even, his expression unreadable. His mind, however, worked furiously. Every pier was a stage. Every stage had exits. He searched for them. The rusting ladders, the mooring ropes, the floating shadows of rowboats tied carelessly to posts. He counted their footsteps, noted the uneven slats of the pier, the slick patches where moss grew. Details that might mean survival. Celeste walked stiffly beside him, her face pale but eyes defiant. Kane could see the tremor in her hands. She wasn't used to this, the slow walk toward an execution. He leaned just enough to whisper, his voice steady, low enough only she could hear. When a moment comes, don't think. Move. Her eyes flicked to him, startled, then hardened with understanding. She gave the faintest nod. The guards halted at the pier's edge. Beneath them, the tide surged against stone. A gull screamed overhead, then was lost to the night. One guard smirked, jabbing Kane in the back with the butt of his rifle. End of the line, detective. Kane's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The guards positioned them side by side, facing the water. The foreigner remained a distance away, framed by the headlights of the trucks, cigarette still glowing between his fingers. He didn't need to be close to kill. His power was in command, in watching others do his work. Do it clean, the foreigner called, his voice calm. No noise. The tide is enough. The guards moved in. One grabbed Celeste's arm. The other shoved Kane toward the edge. Kane stumbled deliberately, letting his body sag as though resigned. The guard laughed under his breath, pressing the muzzle of his rifle into Kane's ribs. And that was the opening. Kane moved like a striking snake. His hand shot under his coat, gripping the revolver he'd hidden against his side, shielded from their searches by the fold of his trench. With a sudden twist, he jammed the barrel under the guard's chin and fired. The shot cracked like thunder, echoing across the water. The guard's body collapsed instantly, rifle clattering to the planks. Celeste screamed, not in fear, but in instinctive cover, as Kane spun, revolver snapping toward the second guard. The man froze for half a breath too long. Kane didn't. Another shot, another flash. The second guard pitched backward into the water with a splash that swallowed his scream. Chaos erupted. Shouts rang from the dock. Rifles were raised. Headlights swung wildly as men scrambled. The foreigner remained still, a silhouette carved against the light, watching. Always watching. Kane grabbed Celeste, pulling her into a sprint down the pier. Bullets sparked off metal containers. Splinters flew from wooden crates. Celeste clutched her bag tight against her chest, her breath ragged. This way. Kane barked, dragging her toward the shadow of a crane. They dove behind the massive steel leg as bullets tore through the air, ricocheting against iron with sharp pings. Kane reloaded quickly, shells clinking against wet concrete. "Are you hit?" he asked. Celeste shook her head, gasping. "No, but they'll surround us." Kane scanned the chaos. The guards were spreading, flanking. He had seconds, maybe less. His eyes fell on a stack of fuel drums by the truck. An idea struck, sharp and dangerous. "Stay down." He ordered that he broke cover, sprinting across open ground. Bullets chased him, sparks flying. He slid behind the drums, raised his revolver, and fired into the metal. The first shot punched a neat hole. The second ignited the fuel within. The explosion was instant and ferocious. Flames roared upward, a rolling wave of fire consuming the night. The blast hurled men off their feet, trucks shuddered, crates toppled into the water. Celeste shielded her head as heat blasted across the pier. The air filled with smoke and screams, confusion tearing order apart. Through the inferno, Kane emerged, grabbing Celeste again. "Move! Now!" They darted along the pier, slipping through smoke and shadows. The fire spread fast, devouring crates of rifles, licking greedily at wooden beams. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. The city had noticed, but Kane knew better. By the time the authorities arrived, the foreigner would vanish, leaving only ashes and corpses. They needed more than survival. They needed the foreigner himself. Celeste stumbled, coughing against the smoke. Kane steadied her, scanning desperately. Then he saw him, calm amid chaos. The foreigner stood by a car at the far end of the pier, his coat untouched by flame, his expression unreadable. Two bodyguards flanked him, weapons drawn but useless against the spreading inferno. Their eyes met across the distance. For the first time, Kane saw something flicker in the foreigner's gaze. Curiosity. Not fear, not anger, just the faintest intrigue, as though Kane had passed some unspoken test. The foreigner tipped his hat. Then he stepped into the waiting car. "No!" Celeste cried, starting forward. Kane caught her arm. "Not now. We'll never make it past his guards in time." The car's engine roared. Tires screeched against the wet planks. In seconds, the foreigner's silhouette dissolved into the night, swallowed by smoke and distance. The fire raged, sirens grew louder, and gunfire dwindled as surviving guards scattered. Kane pulled Celeste into the cover of the container stacks, heart pounding. They had escaped death. They had proof in the ledger, but they hadn't won. Not yet. Celeste slumped against the steel, eyes wet with fury. He got away again. Kane holstered his revolver, his face grim. "Yes, but he knows now that we're not just shadows. We drew blood tonight." The flames painted their faces orange, casting long, distorted shadows. For a moment, the world seemed suspended between destruction and revelation. Kane lit a cigarette with shaking hands, inhaled deeply, then exhaled into the smoke-thick night. His voice was low, steady, carrying both exhaustion and resolve. The night doesn't give answers, Celeste. It only gives chances. And tonight, he looked at the burning pier, the chaos they had unleashed. We took one. The fire at Pier 17 consumed more than wood and steel. It devoured silence, tearing the night apart with its roar. Sirens closed in, their wails piercing through the smoke like desperate cries of a city already broken. The harbor became a theater of chaos. Guards fleeing into alleys, flames reflecting in the water, ash drifting like gray snowflakes. Silas Kane stood among it, smoke curling through his hair, revolver still warm in his hand. Celeste pressed against the container wall, eyes shining from firelight and something darker. Fear and fury blended into one. They had survived the foreigner's execution, but survival wasn't victory. Not in a city like this. Kane holstered his weapon and tugged Celeste forward. We move. The cops will clean this up, and they'll bury it with lies. If we stay, we're bodies on a report. Celeste hesitated, glancing back at the pier, at the ledger she still clutched to her chest. What if this is our only chance? We have proof. Proof means nothing without a stage to show it, Kane muttered, dragging her into the smoke. The foreigner owns the stage. The papers, the courts, the men who carry badges. We need more than words. We need the truth sharp enough to cut. They slipped into an alley that reeked of fish and gasoline, shadows swallowing them as red and blue lights bathed the street behind. The cacophony of sirens grew louder, then dimmed as they melted deeper into the veins of the city. For a time, they walked in silence. Only the slap of their shoes against wet pavement. Only the echoes of fire still clawing at the harbor. Kane's mind spun, not in panic, but in cold calculation. Every move ahead had to be precise. Every misstep meant not just his death, but hers too. At last, Celeste broke the silence. Her voice was hoarse from smoke, but steady. You've hunted him for months, maybe years. And tonight, you saw him. You had him in your sight. Why didn't you? Because the foreigner isn't just a man, Kane interrupted. His tone was sharp, but his eyes distant, lost in thought. He's a symbol. You kill a man, you bury him. You kill a symbol, and the whole rotten city collapses with it. That's why he looked at me like that tonight. He wanted me to know. He doesn't fear bullets. He fears something else. Celeste clutched the ledger tighter. Then these names, these numbers, this is what he fears. Kane's gaze flicked to the book, then back to the endless stretch of darkened alley. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The weight of her words hung heavy between them. They reached Kane's office just before dawn. The city had begun to stir, restless in its own misery. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened with neon reflections, as if the sky itself had tried to wash the sins away and failed. Inside, the office was the same as it had always been. Dust thick on the blinds, whiskey bottles empty in the corner, smoke stains on the ceiling like bruises that never healed. Kane shut the door behind them and locked it. Celeste dropped into the chair opposite his desk, the ledger resting before her like a sacred text. She looked exhausted, but her eyes still burned. What now? She asked. Kane lit a cigarette, leaning against the window. He inhaled slowly, the ember glowing red in the dim light. Now, he said, we bleed him. Eaten be eaten. This city runs on a shadow. We tear holes in it until there's nowhere left to hide. Celeste shook her head. You sound like you've done this before. Kane's eyes darkened, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. I have, and it never ends clean. The day dragged. Kane worked through the ledger, dissecting names, connections, hidden transactions. Each line was a chain, linking the foreigner's empire to politicians, police captains, businessmen. Corruption mapped itself across the pages like veins of rot running through marble. Celeste watched him, sometimes helping, sometimes silent. At moments, she studied Kane more than the ledger. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic. The way he tapped ash from his cigarette at exact intervals. The way he muttered details under his breath as if afraid silence might swallow them. By nightfall, they had a web of leads pinned across Kane's board. Names circled in red. Arrows connecting faces. A city laid bare in ink and twine. But the foreigner remained at the center, untouchable. A void that no arrow could pierce. Celeste rose, crossing the room to stand beside him. "You can't do this alone," she said. "He'll expect it. He'll crush you if you try." Kane studied her for a long moment, smoke curling between them. Then, almost reluctantly, he nodded. "Maybe you're right." The knock came after midnight. 3 sharp raps against the office door. Kane's hand dropped instantly to his revolver. Celeste stiffened. The knock came again. Slow, measured. Kane signaled Celeste to stay back. He opened the door a crack, revolver hidden behind the frame. That a man stood in the hall, hat low, coat dripping rain. His face was shadowed, but Kane recognized the stance, the stillness of someone trained to kill. "Detective Kane," the man said softly. His accent was faint, foreign. "My employer sends regards." Kane's muscles coiled. "Your employer should have stayed in the fire." The man smiled faintly. "He survived worse. He respects you now, and he offers an invitation." He held out a small card, black, embossed with nothing but a time and place. "Midnight, tomorrow." Kane stared at it, then at the messenger. "And if I don't show?" The man's smile never wavered. "Then the lady dies." His eyes flicked past Kane to Celeste standing stiff inside the office. Then he tipped his hat and vanished in the stairwell. Kane closed the door slowly. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with rage contained in steel. That Celeste's voice broke the silence. "You can't go. It's a trap." Kane stared at the card. "Midnight, tomorrow." A rendezvous written in ink, but carved in blood. "All traps are opportunities," he said, voice low. "The difference is how you step into them." The following night arrived like judgment. The address on the card led to a derelict theater at the edge of the city. Once, it had been grand. Chandeliers, velvet curtains, a stage that held dreams. Now it was dust and rot. Seats collapsed, rats scurrying through aisles. Kane entered alone. Celeste had begged to come, but he forced her to stay behind. If this was to end, it had to be his hand. The stage lights flickered to life as he stepped into the center. Shadows peeled back to reveal the foreigner, seated calmly in the front row, cigarette glowing like a watchful. "Detective Kane," he said smoothly. At last, face to face. Kane didn't raise his gun. "Not yet. You try to drown me, burn me, and now you invite me to a theater? What's next?" Applause. The foreigner chuckled. "You misunderstand. This city has many players, but only 2 who matter. You and I. Everyone else." He gestured vaguely to the darkness. "Scenery." Kane's jaw tightened. "You built your empire on blood and fear. Tonight, it ends." The foreigner leaned forward, eyes glinting in the dim light. Does it begin again, with you by my side?" For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The theater seemed to hold its breath. Kane's hand hovered over his revolver. The weight of years of violence, loss, and unanswered questions bore down on him. He could kill the man now, in the rain, or he could accept what the foreigner offered: power, survival. But the cost of his soul, the city's future, hung in that fragile silence. Then Kane drew. The gunshot cracked like thunder, echoing through the hollow theater. Smoke curled upward, mingling with dust and shattered silence. When it cleared, the foreigner slumped in his seat, cigarette extinguished at last. Kane lowered his revolver slowly. His breath came heavy, his hand trembling. The man was dead, the symbol broken. But as the echoes faded, Kane realized something chilling. Killing the foreigner hadn't ended anything. It had only created a vacancy, a void the city would rush to fill with blood. The night outside remained unchanged, neon glowing, rain falling, sins unwashed. Kane holstered his gun, stepping into the aisle. His face was carved with shadows, his eyes hollow but burning to Celeste's words echoed in his mind. You can't do this alone. Maybe she was right. Maybe the war was just beginning. That he lit a cigarette, smoke curling like ghosts into the rafters. His voice was a whisper lost to the empty theater. The night doesn't give answers. Only more questions. And with that, Silas Kane walked out into the rain-soaked city, his silhouette swallowed by neon and darkness. Alone, but unbroken. The city woke to news of a fire at Pier 17, a collapsed warehouse, and whispers of dead men with no names. The papers dressed it up with neat lies. Gang warfare, insurance fraud, another tragedy swallowed by the harbor. No mention of the foreigner. No mention of the detective who walked away from it all. Silas Kane sat by his office window, blinds half closed, smoke curling from the cigarette between his fingers. The city stretched beyond, gray and wet, a painting done in ash and neon. He had killed the man, but the shadow remained. Already, whispers filled the alleys. New bosses, new deals, the same old blood. The foreigner was gone, but the machine he built still turned. Celeste lingered at his desk, flipping through the ledger one last time. Her voice was soft but steady. If we give this to the papers, if we leak it, someone will believe. Kane shook his head. They'll twist it. They'll bury it. Truth doesn't survive in a city like this. It gets bought, sold, burned. He exhaled smoke, eyes heavy. The only thing that lasts here is the fight. Celeste studied him, her gaze somewhere between admiration and sorrow. And what about you? How long can you keep fighting? Kane didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Outside, rain began again, tapping the glass like impatient fingers. The city, restless as ever, hungry for its next tragedy. Kane ground the cigarette into the ashtray, stood, and reached for his coat. Where are you going? Celeste asked as he paused at the door, silhouette carved in dim light. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of every night before. Back into the dark. It's the only place I belong. And then he was gone, swallowed by rain and neon. Another ghost among the city's endless shadows. Celeste sat alone in the office, the ledger still open before her. For a moment, she thought of closing it, of walking away, of finding a life untouched by smoke and blood. But then she looked out the window at the city shimmering with false light, and she understood some stories can't end. They only spiral. She closed the ledger gently, as if it were a prayer. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, carried on the rain. The night went on.